I didn't argue when he said the house was his. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for the paper he kept waving in front of my face like it was some kind of verdict. I didn't even blink, really. I just sat there at my own kitchen table, with my coffee going cold in my hands, watching him move around the room like a man who had already written the ending. Like I was a footnote. Like 53 years of my life in that house were something he could fold up and tuck into a manila envelope. It was a Tuesday morning in Savannah. October. The kind of October morning where the light comes in through the old plantation shutters in long, dusty bars, and the air still smells like yesterday's rain and the gardenias that grow along the side fence, the ones my mother planted before I was born. The refrigerator hummed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked the way it always did, like nothing had changed, but everything had changed. His name was Garrett Hollis, my late husband's younger brother, and he was standing in my kitchen, in the kitchen where I had cooked 30 Thanksgiving dinners, where I had taught my children to make biscuits, where I had sat in the dark at 2 a.m. after the worst nights of my life, standing there in a suit that cost more than my first car, holding a document he clearly believed had ended something. He said, "Vivian, I know this is hard, but the trust is clear. The property transfers to the Hollis family estate. You were only ever a co-trustee, and with Robert gone, that designation expired. This is just how Robert set it up." I remember the word just, like it was a small thing, like Robert, my husband of 31 years, had sat in some attorney's office and written me out of my own home as a casual afterthought. I remember thinking, when did I become a problem to be managed in my own house? And I remember something else, something that had been sitting quiet in me for 3 weeks, ever since Garrett had first started talking about the estate, ever since he'd started showing up with folders and phone calls and that particular tone men use when they've decided you've already lost. Banks don't call the wrong person. And at exactly 9:14 that morning, my phone buzzed on the counter beside me. I looked at the screen. First National Bank of Savannah. Garrett didn't notice. He was still talking. I let it go to voicemail, but I smiled, just a little, into my cold coffee, because I already knew what that call was about. I had been waiting for it. And the fact that it had come today, of all days, while Garrett stood in my kitchen holding his document like a prize. Well, some things have their own sense of timing. If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, hit like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Keep watching until the very end, because at minute 15, you'll get a major reveal. Let me go back. Let me tell you how we got to that Tuesday morning. Because none of it started with Garrett. It started 31 years before him. It started with Robert. Robert Hollis was not a flashy man. He was the kind of man who wore the same watch for 20 years and never mentioned it. He ran a small architectural salvage business on the edge of Savannah's historic district. Original heart pine floors, antique mantelpieces, transom windows pulled from old houses before demolition crews could take them. He loved old things. He believed old things had souls. That was how he felt about the house on Gaston Street, too. We bought it the year after we married. It was a wreck then. A Greek revival that had been broken into apartments in the 1970s and left to slowly digest itself, peeling paint, sagging floors, a kitchen that belonged in a museum of regret. Robert's family thought we were crazy. His mother said, and I remember this exactly, "You two are going to drown yourselves in that old pile." We didn't drown. We spent 11 years bringing it back. Robert did most of the structural work himself, on weekends and in the evenings after the shop closed, with my brother-in-law Franklin holding the other end of the boards. I did everything else. The permits, the contractors, the financing, the decisions about which windows to restore and which plaster to save. I ran the budget like a general. We refinanced twice. We took out a home equity loan in 1997 that made my stomach hurt every month until we paid it off. We sacrificed vacations, new cars, and about 400 hours of sleep. But in 2001, the house was done. And it was, I say this without vanity, magnificent. 4 bedrooms, 12-foot ceilings, original heart pine floors Robert had salvaged from a demolished mill in Brunswick, a wraparound porch with turned columns that we'd matched to the historic registry photographs, a kitchen that finally worked, a garden my mother would have wept over. The Savannah Morning News ran a small feature. The historic Savannah Foundation gave us a preservation award. Our neighbors brought casseroles, and Robert stood on the front porch that first night with a glass of sweet tea and said to me, "Vivienne, we made something that'll outlast us." He was right. What he didn't say, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that outlasting us has a legal shape, a shape written in deeds and trusts and beneficiary designations. And that shape can be changed quietly by the wrong hands at the wrong time. Robert got sick in the spring of 2019, pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came fast and the decline came faster. By August, he was in hospice at home, in the bedroom where we'd slept for 30 years, and I was sleeping in the chair beside him because I couldn't be more than 6 feet away from him. He died on a Wednesday morning in September. The gardenias were still blooming, and within 2 weeks, Garrett Hollis had arrived in Savannah with a briefcase. I want to be fair to Garrett, because I think fairness matters even when people don't deserve it. Garrett was not a monster. He was something more ordinary than a monster. He was a man who had spent his whole life feeling like the lesser Hollis, the younger brother, the one who left Savannah for Atlanta, who had a commercial real estate career that was solid but never spectacular, who had married and divorced twice and arrived at 60 with a sharp wardrobe and a calculation behind his eyes that he'd learned to call business acumen. He had been waiting for Robert to die, not gleefully, not with active cruelty, but with the patience of a man who knows an inheritance is coming and has spent years quietly measuring the distance between himself and the front of the line. The trust was the problem, or rather, the trust was the weapon. Robert had set it up in 2003 after a conversation with his estate attorney, a man named Beaumont Fry, who was very old, very expensive, and very much Robert's family's attorney, not mine. The trust held the house and the salvage business. Robert was the primary trustee. I was named co-trustee, but there was a clause I hadn't fully understood when I signed because Beaumont Fry had explained it in the kind of language that sounds reassuring until you realize it isn't. The clause said that upon the death of the primary trustee, the co-trustee designation would lapse pending review by the successor trustee, and the successor trustee, named in the document, was the Hollis Family Estate Management, LLC, which Garrett had incorporated in 2018, 1 year before Robert's diagnosis. I didn't know that at the time. I learned it later. What I knew in October of 2019 was that a month after Robert died, Garrett had presented himself at Beaumont Fry's office with a copy of the trust, a letter from the LLC, and a very smooth argument that I was no longer empowered to make decisions about the house or the business. Beaumont Fry, who was 78 years old and had known Garrett Hollis since he was 10, agreed with him. And that was how I found myself sitting at my own kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October, watching my brother-in-law wave a document at me. But here is the thing about quiet women. We are not quiet because we have nothing to say. I had spent 3 weeks, 22 days to be exact, since Garrett had first mentioned the succession procedure at Robert's funeral reception, doing things very carefully and very quietly. The first thing I had done was call my own attorney, not Beaumont Fry, my attorney, a woman named Claudette Marsh, who ran a small estate and property law practice on Whitaker Street and who had the kind of eyes that missed nothing. I had found her through my friend Dorothy, who had used her in a contentious divorce, and Dorothy had said, "Claudette doesn't lose, and she doesn't let you lose either, even when it looks like you already have." The second thing I had done was call First National Bank of Savannah, because the house on Gaston Street had a mortgage. A small one. We'd refinanced in 2017 to pull equity for the new roof, but a real one, in both Robert's name and mine, on the property itself. And the trust held the property, but the mortgage was a separate instrument, a lien, and liens follow property, not trustees. I was a co-borrower on that mortgage. No trustee designation, no matter how Beaumont Fry read it, could change who was on the mortgage note. And when I had called First National 3 weeks ago to ask a quiet question about what happened to a jointly held mortgage when one borrower died, the loan officer, a cautious, careful man named Gerald Whitfield, had told me that the surviving co-borrower remained fully liable, that the bank's relationship was with me as much as with anyone, that if there were any changes to the account or the property title that might affect the bank's collateral position, the bank would need to be notified and would need to approve. And then I had said, very calmly, "Mr. Whitfield, I believe my brother-in-law may be attempting to file documents with the county recorder that would affect the title. I would like you to note in the account record that I have not authorized any such filing, and I would like to request that the bank place a flag on the account pending my attorney's review." Gerald Whitfield had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, "Mrs. Hollis, I'll make a note and have our legal department review the account status. If anything comes in that requires your authorization and we don't have it, we'll call you." That was 3 weeks ago. And now my phone was buzzing with a call from First National Bank of Savannah while Garrett was still talking. I let him finish. I let him say everything he'd prepared. I let him explain the trust clause, the LLC designation, the transition timeline, his very reasonable offer to let me remain in the house as a tenant, for a period of 2 years while the estate reorganized, a tenant. In the house Robert and I had built with 11 years of our lives. When he finished, I set my coffee mug down on the table. I looked at him, and I said, "Garrett, before we go any further, I think you should know that your filing with the county recorder's office triggered a review at First National." He stopped, just for a moment, a flicker behind his eyes. I said, "They flagged the title transfer attempt because I'm still on the mortgage note, and I did not authorize a title transfer." He recovered quickly. He said, "That's just a procedural matter. The bank will be notified through proper channels. Beaumont has already prepared a letter." I said, "Garrett, the bank called me this morning," and I picked up my phone and played the voicemail on speaker. The voice of Gerald Whitfield, calm and professional, said that First National Bank of Savannah had placed a hold on the property account pending resolution of the conflicting ownership documentation, and that they were requesting a meeting with all parties named on the mortgage note before any title changes could be processed, and that the bank's legal department would be in touch with both Mrs. Vivian Hollis and the trustee of record. Garrett's face did something complicated. I said, "I think we should call your attorney and my attorney and set up that meeting." He said, "Vivian, you're making this harder than it has to be." I said, "I know," and I got up to warm my coffee. "Now, I need to tell you about my children, because they are the real story. They were the reason I didn't simply walk away from that house, take what Garrett offered, and let it go. I had 3 grown children and one who might as well have been mine, and each of them carried a piece of this house in their chests. My daughter Margot was 51 years old and lived 20 minutes away in Midtown Savannah with her husband and their 2 teenage daughters. Margot was the oldest. She had inherited Robert's steadiness and my stubbornness, which made her either the most reliable person in a crisis or the most exhausting, depending on the day. She was a hospital administrator, organized, precise, emotionally controlled in the way that people who've been hurt learn to be. She had been at the funeral home with me, handling logistics, while I was still in shock. She had made the calls, chosen the casket, written the obituary. She had done all of it quietly and efficiently, and I had never once seen her cry. I worried about Margot, because I knew she was grieving in a room no one could get into. My son Desmond was 47 and lived in Atlanta, where he ran a consulting firm. Desmond was brilliant, Robert's brains and my father's impatience. He came back to Savannah every few months, and every time he did, he found something wrong with something. The roof needed work. The salvage business was under-leveraged. The trust should have been restructured in 2010. He was always right, and always about 3 steps ahead of the conversation, and it made people feel slightly stupid around him, which was never his intention, but was always his effect. He loved his father with a ferocity he could never have named out loud, and Robert's death had left him with nowhere to put that ferocity. When I told him about Garrett's claim, Desmond had gone very quiet for 30 seconds. Then he said, "Mom, do not sign anything. I'll be there Thursday." My younger daughter Ansley was 43 and was, honestly, the one I worried about most. She had always been the sensitive one, the one who felt everything sideways, who took other people's pain into her body like weather. She was a watercolor painter and taught art at a magnet school, and she lived alone in a small bungalow on the edge of the Starland district that she decorated with plants and secondhand rugs and her own paintings stacked against every wall. She had been in a long relationship that ended badly, and the ending had left her quiet in a way that was different from Margot's quietness. Margot was sealed. Ansley was thinned, like paper that's been held up to the light too many times. When I told Ansley about Garrett, she had cried. Then she'd dried her eyes and said, "What do you need me to do?" And the fourth, the one who was mine in every way except biology, was Franklin Jr. We called him Frankie. He was 45, the son of Robert's best friend, Franklin Sr., who had died in a car accident when Frankie was 9. We had taken Frankie in, not formally adopted. His mother had her own family in Beaufort, but he spent school years with us, summer months, every Thanksgiving and Christmas from the time he was 10 until he left for the Navy at 18. He called Robert Dad R., short for Dad Robert, and he called me Miss Viv, even now, and he was the one who had held the ladder every time Robert climbed to the roof, and the one who had come back to Savannah 5 years ago to work in the salvage business when Robert's health started to slip. Frankie was now the de facto manager of Hollis Salvage and Architectural. He knew every piece of inventory, every client relationship, every supplier. He had kept the business alive through Robert's illness and through the grief that followed. Garrett wanted the business too. It was in the trust, along with the house, and Frankie, loyal, steady, quietly devastated Frankie, was the first person I thought of when I started to understand what was at stake. Because Frankie wasn't family, not on paper. He had no standing in the trust, no legal claim to the business he'd given 5 years of his life to. He was an employee, technically, with no contract, with nothing but Robert's word, spoken and never written. And I knew, the minute Garrett started talking about restructuring the business operations, that Frankie was in danger. That was the thing Garrett had not accounted for. He had planned for my grief. He had planned for my unfamiliarity with trust law. He had planned for Beaumont Fry's loyalty and the family attorney network that had always served the Hollis name, not the Hollis wives. What he had not planned for was how many quiet preparations a steady woman can make in 3 weeks when she has a reason to stay calm. He had not planned for Claudette Marsh, and he had not planned for Gerald Whitfield at First National Bank. Let me tell you about the filing. The Monday before Garrett's Tuesday visit, he had sent a courier to the Chatham County Recorder's office with a package of documents. The package included a certification from the Hollis Family Estate Management LLC asserting trustee authority, a deed transfer form, and a letter from Beaumont Fry. The filing was designed to transfer the Gaston Street property title out of the family trust and into the LLC's name, a move that would have given Garrett full control of the asset and effectively ended any legal argument I could make about my status in the house. It was well prepared. Beaumont Fry was old, but he was not careless. What Garrett had not known was that Claudette had already been to the recorder's office herself 2 weeks earlier to file a notice of contested ownership on behalf of Vivienne Hollis, citing my status as a co-borrower on the existing mortgage and my position as the surviving spouse of the original trust grantor. The notice didn't stop Garrett's filing, but it created a flag, a notation in the property record that said, in official language, "This title is disputed." And when Garrett's courier arrived with his package, the recorder's office had processed it, but had simultaneously sent a copy of the contested notice to First National Bank, because First National was listed as the mortgage holder on the property. Banks are not emotional institutions. They don't care about family drama or brothers-in-law or trust clauses. They care about collateral. They care about whose name is on the note and whether the collateral securing their loan is being transferred without their knowledge. Gerald Whitfield cared very much, and that was the call that came to me at 9:14 on Tuesday morning. Now I need to tell you about the deadline, because there was one, and it was real, and it was the thing that had been keeping me awake at night for 22 days. The Chatham County Probate Court had scheduled a hearing for November 15th, 36 days away. The purpose of the hearing was to formally adjudicate the trust succession, to determine who had legal authority over the Hollis family trust and its assets. Beaumont Fry had initiated the hearing on Garrett's behalf. Claudette had filed our response. If the probate court ruled in Garrett's favor, the house was effectively his to manage. I could contest it further, but that meant years of litigation, money I didn't have, and the kind of grinding legal uncertainty that wears people down into surrender. November 15th, 36 days. That was the clock I was living under. And there was something else, something Claudette had told me that I hadn't yet told my children, because I was still deciding how. When Robert had set up the trust in 2003, Beaumont Fry had drafted it. But in 2011, Robert had come to Claudette's office alone, without me, without Beaumont, and he had done something quiet and unremarkable that I would not learn about until Claudette told me, in her calm office on Whitaker Street, 40 days after Robert died. He had drafted a codicil, not to his will, to the trust itself, a trust amendment. The amendment modified the successor trustee provision. It named the Hollis Family Estate Management LLC as a potential successor only in the event that no surviving spouse was actively involved in the management or occupation of the trust property at the time of succession. I had been living in that house and actively managing the salvage business, handling the financial accounts, the insurance, the property taxes, every single day of Robert's illness and every day since his death. By the terms of Robert's own amendment, I qualified as the successor co-trustee. The amendment had been notarized by a notary in Claudette's office. It had been stored in her files. It had never been filed with the county recorder. Robert had apparently not wanted to create a paper trail that Garrett might find, but it was legally valid. A trust amendment doesn't require recording to be enforceable. Beaumont Fry did not know it existed. Garrett did not know it existed. And I had known for exactly 38 days, since the day after Robert's funeral, when Claudette had called me and said, "Vivienne, I have something I need to show you that Robert left in my care." I had cried for about 40 minutes in Claudette's office when I read it, not because it saved anything, but because it meant Robert had seen this coming. It meant he had known, somewhere in himself, that Garrett would try. And he had done something about it, quietly, carefully, the way he did everything, and he had trusted Claudette to hold it for me. He had trusted her because I had always trusted her. And now, with 36 days until the probate hearing, we were going to use it. But not yet. Not until the moment was right. Garrett left my house that Tuesday morning looking unsettled in a way he worked very hard to hide. He said he would have Beaumont call Claudette. He said there was no reason for this to become adversarial. He said, and this was the phrase I would think about for days afterward, "Vivienne, Robert would want this handled smoothly." I said, "I know what Robert would want, Garrett," and I held the front door open for him. After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick and the sound of his rental car pulling away down the street. Then I picked up my phone and called Desmond. He answered on the first ring. I said, "He came this morning." Desmond said, "And?" I said, "I think we're ready." There was a pause. Then Desmond said, "I'll be there tonight." I called Margot next. She said, "Should I bring the girls?" I said, "No, not yet. This was for us first." She said, "I'll be there at 6. I called Ansley. She started to cry before I finished the first sentence. I said, "Ansley, listen, we are not losing this house." She went quiet. Then she said, Okay, I'll be there." And then I called Frankie. He picked up from the salvage yard. I could hear the sounds of the business behind him, the distant ring of metal on wood, the familiar creak of the warehouse doors. He said, "Miss Viv, I heard Garrett's car in the drive this morning from the yard." I said, "I need you to come to the house tonight, Frankie. There are things you need to hear." He said, "I'll be there." That night, a Tuesday night in late October, with rain coming in off the river and the gardenias finally spent, my 4 children sat around the dining room table in the house on Gaston Street, the same table where we'd had 30 Thanksgiving dinners, where I'd helped with homework and argued about curfews and celebrated graduations, where Robert had sat at the head for 30 years. His chair was still there. Nobody sat in it. I sat at the other end. Claudette sat beside me. She had come without being asked. I'd called her after the others, and she'd said, "I'll bring the file." I told them everything: the trust, the amendment, the probate hearing date, the bank hold, Garrett's visit. Desmond was the first to speak. He said, very quietly, he incorporated the LLC in 2018. Margot said, "Before Dad was diagnosed." Desmond said, "Just before." The table was quiet for a moment. Ansley said, "Did Dad know about Garrett's plan?" I said, "I think he suspected. That's why he went to Claudette in 2011. Frankie hadn't said anything yet. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the surface of the wood. I watched him. I knew what he was thinking. I said, "Frankie, there's something else." He looked up. I said, "Robert left a letter in Claudette's file, along with the trust amendment. Claudette slid the envelope across the table. Frankie looked at his name on the front of it, written in Robert's unmistakable block letters, the way he'd written everything, clean and careful, and I watched something move through him. He didn't open it at the table. He just put his hand on it and nodded. Later, he told me what it said. Robert had written that Frankie was to be considered a partner in the salvage business, morally if not legally, and that he wished, that was the word, wished, that if it was ever possible, the business be structured to give Frankie ownership standing. He had also written, and this was the part that undid both of us, "You are my son in every way that matters." I should have said that more. I didn't hear Frankie cry, but Ansley told me later that he went out to the back porch for 20 minutes, and when he came in, his eyes were red and his jaw was set, and he said, "What do we need to do?" That was the night everything shifted. We had 36 days. Claudette had a plan, but plans require people, and people require courage. And courage, the real kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, was the thing I was most uncertain about. I was wrong to doubt it. Every single one of them surprised me. The next 2 weeks were a kind of controlled intensity that I had never quite experienced before. It was like running a campaign, a quiet, disciplined, parallel campaign to Garrett's, and the goal was to make sure that by November 15th, the probate court had the complete picture. Claudette's strategy had 3 parts. First, establish my active management status. I gathered 2 years of financial records showing that I had been the primary manager of the household and the business accounts, bank statements, property tax receipts, insurance payments, vendor invoices, contractor communications, all of it in my name or jointly in mine and Robert's, all of it showing continuous engagement, the savings account, the business checking account, the mortgage payments, 24 months of documentation that said I had not stepped back. I had not retired from my own life. Second, produce the trust amendment. Claudette would present it at the probate hearing with the notarized certification and her own witness testimony that Robert had come to her office in 2011 and executed it voluntarily and with full capacity. Third, the bank. Gerald Whitfield had agreed, carefully, professionally, staying well within his institutional role, to provide a written account of the mortgage situation to the court, if subpoenaed. He was not an ally in any partisan sense. He was simply a careful man at a careful institution, and what he had to say was factually clear. I was a co-borrower. The bank had a lien, and any title transfer without my authorization created a potential default situation. Garrett, to his credit, was not idle. Beaumont Fry filed a challenge to the trust amendment's validity, arguing that a side document held in an attorney's file without county recording was insufficient to modify a formally recorded trust. It was a real legal argument. Claudette acknowledged it was real. She said, "He's not wrong that it's an argument. He's just wrong about how Georgia courts are likely to receive it." She was precise about the outcome, but not certain. That uncertainty was its own kind of weight to carry. Around this time, something happened that I hadn't expected. Something that came from outside the legal machinery. Her name was Rosalie Tran. Rosalie had started working as a part-time companion for Robert in his final months, a home health aide arranged through a hospice agency who came 3 days a week to sit with him and help me manage the physical demands of care. She was in her mid-30s, Vietnamese American, quiet and observant, with the particular kind of patience that people develop when they've seen a lot of hard things and decided not to be destroyed by them. After Robert died, she had continued coming by. Not in any professional capacity, just to check on me. She brought soup sometimes. She sat with me in the garden. She didn't try to fix anything or say the right thing. She just showed up. I hadn't realized what she'd seen. I hadn't realized how carefully she had been paying attention. One afternoon in early November, about 2 weeks before the hearing, she came to the back door and found me in the kitchen, going through a box of old files, looking for a property tax receipt from 2018 that I needed for Claudette's records. I was frustrated. I had been through 3 boxes and couldn't find it. Rosalie sat down across the table from me and said, "Mrs. Hollis, I need to tell you something." I looked up. She said, "I don't know if it matters, but during the last months when I was here with Mr. Robert, his brother came by 3 times. Mr. Robert wasn't always. He had good days and bad days. The last time Mr. Garrett came, Mr. Robert was having a bad day. I went still." She said, "Mr. Garrett brought papers. I don't know what they were. I was in the other room. But I heard Mr. Robert say, I didn't agree to that. And then I heard Mr. Garrett say, you already signed it, Robert. And Mr. Robert said, I remember exactly. He said, I don't think I understood what I was signing. The room was very quiet. She said, I didn't know if it was my place. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. I said, do you remember when this was? She said, July, before the 4th of July, because I remember the fireworks trucks were already setting up on River Street. I called Claudette that evening. Claudette said Rosalie's testimony could be significant. If Garrett had Robert sign something during a period of cognitive diminishment, and we can establish that the July timeline corresponds with Robert's documented decline, then any document signed in that period may be challengeable. She said, I'll need to talk to her. Rosalie was, as I expected, nervous. She was worried about being involved in something legal. She was worried about what Garrett might do, about her reputation, about being dismissed because she was the aide, the help, not the family. I understood that worry. I had watched Frankie navigate that same invisible boundary for 20 years, the person who was everything to the family and nothing in the documents. I told Rosalie the truth. I said, what you saw matters, what you heard matters, Robert's voice matters. I said, no one is asking you to attack anyone. We're just asking you to say what you heard. She sat with it for a day. Then she called Claudette's office. I will not overstate what Rosalie's account eventually meant to the legal case. Claudette was careful to tell me it wasn't the centerpiece. The trust amendment was the centerpiece. But Rosalie's account gave us something harder to argue against than any legal document. It gave us Robert's own words. I didn't agree to that. I don't think I understood what I was signing. That was Robert, even at the end, even on a bad day, still trying to hold the line. Desmond, meanwhile, had been doing what Desmond does, which is to treat a problem like an engineering project and dismantle it by component. He had hired an independent accountant to review the business records of the Hollis Family Estate Management LLC, the LLC Garrett had incorporated in 2018. It took time and it cost money, but what the accountant found was useful. The LLC had, in the year following its incorporation, opened a secondary bank account and transferred into it a sum of money that corresponded almost exactly to a disbursement from the Hollis Family Trust, a disbursement that Robert, in the later stages of his illness, had apparently authorized. Desmond said he moved trust money into his own LLC before Dad died. I said, is that illegal? Desmond said, it depends. If he had authority to request the disbursement, if Robert signed something authorizing it, then technically no. But the timing and the account destination and the fact that neither you nor we knew about it. He paused. It's the kind of thing that makes a judge look very carefully. Claudette agreed that it was relevant. She filed a motion to compel disclosure of the LLC's financial records in connection with the probate proceeding. Beaumont Fry filed an objection. The judge granted the motion. Things were moving. Meanwhile, there was something happening with Margot that I was watching from the corner of my eye. Margot had been controlled, efficient. She had attended every meeting, taken every note, handled the logistics of the probate filing preparation with the precision she brought to everything. But underneath all of it, I could see the thing that wasn't moving, the grief she'd locked in a room. Then, the Tuesday night before the hearing, she came to the house late. After the children had gone home, after the day's preparations were done, she let herself in with her key and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She sat down across from me. She said, Mom. I said, Margot. She said, I keep thinking about the day I came to help Dad sort through his files. 2 years ago, when he was first getting sick. She stopped. He handed me this old envelope. He said, keep this somewhere safe. You don't need to read it yet. You'll know when. I said, did you keep it? She went into her bag. She put an envelope on the table, my name on the front, Robert's handwriting. I don't know why I started to cry. I had thought I was past the immediate grief. I had thought the legal pressure had pushed it somewhere I could manage. But the sight of my name in his handwriting, on an envelope I hadn't known existed, at 11:30 at night in a kitchen he would never stand in again. I opened it slowly. It was 2 pages. His handwriting, steady and block-lettered, the way he wrote everything. He wrote about the house, about what it meant to him, about what he'd seen Garrett doing in those final years, The questions about the trust, the LLC, the careful way Garrett had inserted himself into conversations with Beaumont Fry at family gatherings. Robert had known. He'd done what he could. The trust amendment, the letter for Frankie, this letter for me. And then he'd run out of time. He wrote, "Vivian, I know you already know. You always know. I just need you to hear me say, the house is yours. It was always ours, but it's yours now, and you have every right to fight for it. Please fight for it." And at the end, "I'm sorry I didn't make it cleaner. I'm sorry I trusted old loyalty over good sense. I loved Garrett. I think I still do. But I love you more. I loved you more every year." Margot sat with me while I read it, and when I was done, she reached across the table and took my hand, and I felt something in her, some sealed door, open just slightly. Not all the way, not enough to call it healed, but open. She said, "He knew." I said, "He knew." We sat there for a while in the quiet kitchen, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the porch light making a pool of gold on the garden path. Then Margot said, very quietly, "We're going to win." I said, "Yes, we are." The night before the probate hearing, Garrett called me. It was 9 o'clock. I was in bed, reading, trying to conserve what steadiness I had left. His name came up on the phone, and I almost didn't answer. Then I did. He said, "Vivian, I think we should talk before tomorrow." I said, "I'm listening." He said, "I want you to know that I never intended for this to be. I know it's looked a certain way. I know it's felt adversarial, but I was trying to protect Robert's legacy, the way he would have wanted." I let him say it. I didn't interrupt. Then he said, "I have an offer. I want to propose, before we go through a public hearing, a settlement. The house stays in your possession as a life estate. You can live there as long as you want. The business transfers to the LLC, which Frankie can continue to manage as a paid employee. When you're gone, the house transfers to the Hollis estate, a life estate. I could live in my own house as long as I stayed alive, and then it would become Garrett's. And the business Robert and Franklin Sr. had built, that Frankie had given years of his life to, would become Garrett's LLC's asset, with Frankie as an employee with no security and no ownership." I said, "Garrett, I appreciate you calling." He said, "Vivian." I said, "I'll see you tomorrow." And I hung up. I slept well that night, actually, better than I had in weeks. I don't know if it was the letter or Margot's hand across the table or simply the exhaustion of preparation finally converting into calm. But I slept, and in the morning I put on the dark blue dress I wore when I meant business, and I drove to the Chatham County Courthouse. Claudette was already there when I arrived. So was Desmond, in a gray suit, looking more like Robert than I could ever tell him without making him uncomfortable. Margot stood beside him, composed and fierce. Ansley was there in a dark green jacket I'd never seen before. She had bought it, she told me later, because she wanted to feel armored. And Frankie stood at the end of the line in a white shirt with his good shoes, his hands steady at his sides. Rosalie was there too. In the corridor, in a dark blazer, sitting quietly with a woman from Claudette's office who had helped prepare her statement. She gave me a small nod when I arrived. I nodded back. The hearing room was smaller than people imagine. Not a grand courtroom, but a wood-paneled room with a long table and a judge who had the measured manner of someone who has seen many versions of this same story. His name was Judge Elias Pemberton. He was 60, gray at the temples, and he read documents rather than faces, which I found reassuring. Garrett sat on the other side of the room with Beaumont Fry, who looked, if I'm honest, exhausted. Beaumont was 78. He had prepared diligently. But he had built his case on the assumption that there was no trust amendment, that the 2003 document was the complete record. Claudette let him make that case first. Beaumont walked through it methodically. The trust, the successor trustee provision, the LLC certification, the Chatham County recording. He was thorough and professional. Garrett sat still beside him with his hands folded, the picture of a reasonable man doing a reasonable thing. Then Claudette stood up. She presented the 2011 trust amendment, the notarized copy, her own affidavit as the attorney who had witnessed the execution. She explained, clearly and precisely, that Robert Hollis had come to her office on April 14, 2011, with full capacity and clear intent, and had executed an amendment to the trust that modified the successor trustee provision. She read the amendment aloud. The amendment said, and the language was specific, that the LLC successor provision applied only in the event that no surviving spouse is actively involved in the management or occupation of the trust property. It then defined active involvement as including residence, financial management, or day-to-day operational oversight. Claudette presented the 2 years of financial records, the mortgage statements, the property tax receipts, the business account records, the insurance documents, everything in my name or jointly held, continuously maintained. She said, Mrs. Hollis has been actively and continuously involved in the management of the trust property. Under the terms of the amended trust, the LLC successor provision does not apply. Beaumont's objection was ready. He challenged the amendment's enforceability, argued that an unrecorded trust amendment stored in a third-party attorney's file was insufficient to supersede the recorded trust document. Judge Pemberton asked Claudette to respond. Claudette said, Georgia trust law does not require recording for a trust amendment to be valid. The amendment was properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. The fact that Mr. Hollis chose to store it in trust counsel's files rather than record it is consistent with the privacy that trust instruments typically carry. The document is valid. Pemberton made a note. Then Claudette said, Your Honor, we also have a witness statement relevant to the circumstances under which certain documents may have been signed during the decedent's final months. She called Rosalie. Rosalie walked to the front of the room with her chin up. She sat down. She spoke clearly, without drama, in the careful way of someone who has thought about what they want to say and said exactly that. She described the visits. She described July. She said what she had heard. Garrett's face was very still. Beaumont said, Your Honor, this testimony is... The judge said, I'll allow it. Rosalie finished. She was thanked. She sat back down. The financial records of the LLC were the last piece. Desmond had put together a summary, not inflammatory, just factual, of the disbursement that had moved from the Hollis Trust account to the LLC's secondary account during the period of Robert's illness. Claudette presented it without accusation. She simply noted that the provenance of those funds was relevant to the probate court's evaluation of the LLC's standing as a successor trustee, and that the court's discovery order had compelled their disclosure. Judge Pemberton looked at those records for a long time. Then he looked at Garrett. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't accuse or condemn. He simply said, Mr. Hollis, the trustee owes a fiduciary duty to the trust beneficiaries. Any questions about the movement of trust assets will be examined as part of this proceeding. Garrett said, Of course, Your Honor. But his voice, for the first time I had ever heard it, was uncertain. The hearing broke for lunch. Beaumont and Garrett went into a small conference room. Claudette and I sat in the corridor with coffee from a machine that was terrible and tasted like the best thing I'd had in weeks. Desmond sat beside me and said, You doing okay? I said, I'm fine. He said, Mom, you can drop it for a minute. I looked at him. He looked back at me. I said, I'm tired. I'm so tired, Desmond. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into him, and we sat like that for a few minutes in a courthouse corridor in Savannah, with the hum of the building around us and the sound of other lives being managed in other rooms. When the hearing reconvened, Beaumont Fry stood up and said that his client wished to propose a resolution. I felt Claudette go very still beside me. Beaumont said that, in light of the trust amendment and the related financial questions, his client was prepared to acknowledge the validity of Mrs. Vivienne Hollis's co-trustee status under the amended trust provisions. He said that his client proposed that the Gaston Street property remain under the co-trusteeship of Vivienne Hollis, with Hollis Family Estate Management LLC retaining a minority advisory role in trust decisions, a role without veto authority. He proposed that the business remain in the trust and that Frankie, he called him Franklin Beaumont Jr., the current operations manager, be offered a formal partnership agreement at a percentage to be negotiated. He proposed that the funds transferred from the trust to the LLC account be returned, with documentation, within 60 days. He said that in exchange, Vivienne Hollis would agree not to pursue further legal action regarding the trust administration during Robert's lifetime. Claudette leaned to me and said quietly, It's not everything, but it's close. I looked at my children, arranged along the wall. Margot, composed. Desmond, watching me. Ansley, with her jaw set. Frankie, with Robert's letter still in his breast pocket. I said, "What about the advisory role?" Claudette said, "We can limit it to annual reporting requirements. No decision-making power." I said, "And Frankie's partnership?" She said, "We negotiate the percentage ourselves. We have the leverage." I said, "Okay." She stood up. She said, "Your Honor, Mrs. Hollis is prepared to accept the framework proposed with the following modifications." And she laid them out one by one with the precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. Garrett sat very still on the other side of the room. I watched him. I had spent a long time being angry at him. During those 22 days of preparation, there had been nights when the anger was the cleanest thing I felt, cleaner than grief, cleaner than fear. The anger had been useful. It had kept me sharp. But watching him now, I felt something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet, not entirely, but understanding. I understood that Garrett had spent his whole life in Robert's shadow, wanting a piece of what Robert had, and that the house and the business had represented something to him beyond their monetary value. They had represented a place in the Hollis story, a significance he hadn't been able to build for himself. He had gone about it badly. He had deceived. He had moved trust money. He had possibly obtained a signature under uncertain circumstances. He had looked at a grieving woman in her own kitchen and tried to tell her she was already gone. Those were real harms. They would be real consequences. But I also knew that Robert had loved him. Not always wisely, not always clearly, but genuinely. And that love was part of the house, too, in whatever complicated way it had always been. I did not say any of this to Garrett that day. Some things need to stay in the appropriate room. Judge Pemberton reviewed the proposed resolution. He asked several clarifying questions. He asked about the timeline for the fund return. He asked about the partnership agreement process. He asked Claudette whether her client was entering the agreement voluntarily and with full understanding. Claudette said yes. He asked Beaumont the same about his client. Beaumont said yes. The judge said he would formalize the agreement in an order and that the co-trusteeship of Vivian Hollis was recognized effective immediately. He hit the table once with his pen. Not a gavel, just a pen. And that was that. We walked out of the Chatham County Courthouse at 2:15 in the afternoon. The October light was low and gold, the kind of light that makes Savannah look like a painting of itself. The Spanish moss hung in the live oaks along the street. Somewhere a few blocks over, a church bell rang the quarter hour. Ansley grabbed my arm and said, "Mom." I said, "I know." Frankie was standing on the courthouse steps, looking out at the street with his hands in his pockets. I walked over to him. He turned when he heard me. He said, "Miss Viv." I said, "You're going to have a partnership agreement, Frankie. A real one, with your name on it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad R. would have liked this." I said, "He planned most of it." Frankie looked away, down the street. Then he looked back at me and said, "I got a lot of years left in me. I'm not going anywhere." I said, "I know that." We stood there in the October light for a minute, the two of us, and then Desmond came over and put a hand on both our shoulders and said, "Are we going to lunch, or are we going to stand on these courthouse steps forever?" We went to lunch. Now let me tell you about afterward, because the story didn't end on the courthouse steps. It never does. The fund return happened in December, just before Christmas. Claudette supervised it personally. The money, a sum that represented, I later learned, about 4 years' worth of modest trust disbursements, came back to the trust account with documentation. Garrett wrote no apology letter. Beaumont handled it with the formal silence of someone who had done a thing he would not discuss further. Garrett and I did not see each other for several months after the hearing. He went back to Atlanta. He did not come for Christmas, which was both a relief and a kind of sorrow, because the table was where it was, and the chair was still empty, and no amount of legal victory fills that. He sent a card in January. His handwriting was stiff, the way it is when someone is trying to say something they don't know how to say. He wrote, "I hope you have a good year. I know things are complicated. I'm sorry for the pressure." He didn't say what he was sorry for exactly. I didn't expect precision from him. I put the card on the refrigerator and looked at it for a few weeks, and then put it away. He came to Savannah in March for a brief visit, not to the house, but to Beaumont's office for the finalization of the partnership agreement paperwork. Frankie was there. They shook hands. It was not warm. It was what it was. Afterward, Frankie came to the house and sat on the back porch with me and said, He looks older. I said, we all look older. He said, yeah, but like, defeated older. I thought about that. I thought about what it costs to want something that badly and then not get it. I thought about the difference between grieving a loss and grieving an ambition, how one has dignity and the other is its own kind of punishment. I didn't say that to Frankie. I just said, he'll find his way. Frankie looked skeptical. I said, or he won't. But either way, it's not our job anymore. The partnership agreement was finalized in April. Frankie owned 23% of Hollis Salvage and Architectural, which was what Claudette and Desmond had negotiated. Not the 40% Frankie had privately hoped for, not the 15% the LLC had initially proposed. 23%, with a right of first refusal on future buyout opportunities. It was real. It was his name on the document. He framed the signature page and hung it in the salvage yard's office, next to a photograph of Robert and Franklin Sr. from sometime in the early 1980s, both of them young and grinning and covered in sawdust. I saw it the first time I walked into the office after it went up. I stopped and looked at it for a long moment. I said, is that? Frankie said, it's a picture of our dads. I found it in Dad R's files. I said, I remember that day. They'd just pulled the mantelpiece out of the Crawford house on Bull Street. They thought they'd broken it at first and then realized it was fine. They were so relieved. Frankie said, they look happy. I said, they were. We looked at it together for another minute. Then Frankie went back to work and I went to look at the inventory and the business continued, as it does. The house on Gaston Street. I am in it now. As I tell you this story, I am in it now. The gardenias came back this year with a ferocity that took my breath away. More blooms than I'd seen in a decade. So many that the whole south side of the house smelled like them for 3 weeks in May. My neighbor, Mrs. Adair, said it was because I'd finally gotten the drainage right along the fence line. I chose to believe it was something else. Margot comes every Sunday for dinner now. She did not come every Sunday before the hearing. She came often, but not every Sunday. Something shifted when she took my hand across the kitchen table that night. Some slightly more permeable version of herself arrived, and now she comes every Sunday and she brings the girls, and sometimes she stays until 9 o'clock and we talk about nothing important in the best possible way. She still hasn't cried about her father. Not to me. I expect she does it in private, on her own timeline, in the room she keeps for herself. I don't push, but I watch her daughters run across the backyard in the Sunday evening light, chasing the cat that adopted us in November, and I see Margot watching them from the porch swing with something on her face that might be the beginning of letting go. I leave her to it. Desmond calls from Atlanta every week. He asks about the business numbers, which is his love language, and I report them to him. And he says, good, or interesting, let's watch that. And then he asks how I'm sleeping, and I say fine, and he says, really fine or just fine? And I say really fine, Desmond. And he says, okay. And that is our whole conversation, and it contains everything. Ansley sold 3 paintings in the spring. Real sales, not to friends, not to the school, but through a gallery in Charleston that had reached out after seeing her work in a local show. She called me when the checks arrived and said, Mom, I think I'm a professional now. I said, you've always been a professional. She said, you know what I mean. I said, I know. I'm proud of you. She comes to the house and paints in the garden sometimes. I leave her alone. I bring her iced tea and she says thank you, and then she goes back to wherever she is when she's working. It's good for both of us. Rosalie and I have stayed in touch. She came to the house for dinner in February, which was the first time I'd seen her outside a professional or legal context, and she was different, lighter, more willing to be herself. We sat on the back porch until late and she told me about her own family, her mother's immigration story, the difficulty of caring for people who are dying and carrying that weight out of other people's houses and into your own life. I said, you know what you did mattered. She said, I know. I just needed to get there. I said, we all do. I thought about Rosalie for a long time after that dinner. About what it means to be the person who sees things and isn't sure they're allowed to say what they saw. About the particular bravery of speaking without being certain anyone will believe you. About how many Rosalies there are in the world, sitting in rooms adjacent to power, watching and knowing and wondering whether to say. I hope I told her clearly enough. She mattered. What she did mattered. Not because it won us a case, though it helped, but because it gave Robert's voice back for a moment, in a place where his voice needed to be heard. I don't think I understood what I was signing. I think about that sentence sometimes, alone in the house at 2 in the morning when the refrigerator hums and the clock ticks and the light from the street falls across the hallway floor in familiar bars. I think about all the things we sign without fully understanding. I think about the trust document I signed in 2003, and the mortgage documents, and the marriage certificate, and all the other papers that shape a life without anyone explaining what they'll mean 30 years forward. I think about Robert, in that chair at Beaumont's office in 2003, trusting old loyalty over good sense, as he himself wrote. I think about him 4 years ago in 2011, driving to Claudette's office alone, without telling me, doing the thing he could do and leaving it in her hands for when I needed it. That is love, I think. Not the announcement of it, but the preparation. The quiet work done in the years before the crisis, so that when the crisis comes, you're not entirely alone. The salvage business is doing well. Frankie brought on 2 new apprentices last year, young people who want to learn about historic preservation and have found, to their apparent surprise, that it is both more physical and more meaningful than they expected. One of them, a 23-year-old named Cora with wood shavings perpetually in her hair, said to me one afternoon when I came by the yard, "I didn't know there were so many ways to save something." I said, "That's sort of the whole point." She looked at me like that was the most interesting thing anyone had said to her in a while. Then she went back to sanding a mantelpiece that had come out of a house in the Victorian district, a piece of original yellow pine with a carved frieze that someone had painted over 4 times and was now, slowly, emerging. I stood and watched for a moment. The late afternoon light in the warehouse, the smell of old wood and oil, the sound of careful hands. Robert loved this place. I understand now why he wanted to protect it. Let me tell you what I know now that I didn't know before. I know that grief and vigilance can coexist. I know that you can be devastated and still be paying attention. I know that being a woman of a certain age in a room full of people who have decided you're done is not a defeat. It is a problem, and problems have solutions. If you move quietly and quickly and refuse to accept the first version of the story that someone else is trying to tell you. I know that the people you raise, biological or not, documented or not, carry you forward. That Frankie calling Robert Dad R was not a lesser claim. That Ansley crying and then drying her eyes and saying, "What do you need me to do?" is not weakness. That Margot's sealed door opening 1 inch on a kitchen table at 11:30 at night is not nothing. I know that Garrett was not a monster. He was a man who was afraid of being left out, who let that fear make him greedy, who let that greed make him careless. I don't forgive him easily. Forgiveness has a price, and he has not fully paid it. But I understand him, and understanding is where I am willing to begin. He called in September, a real call, not a card, his voice on the phone, more tired than I remembered. He said he'd been thinking. He said he knew he'd handled things badly. He said, and I could hear how much it cost him. I think I wanted it to feel like I was part of something that mattered, and I went about it wrong. I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "I'm sorry, Vivienne." I said, "I hear you, Garrett." There was a pause. Then he said, "Is there a way forward? For the family?" I said, "There's always a way forward. It's usually slower and harder than the thing you wanted." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Come to Thanksgiving, if you want to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." And then there was the envelope. In August, a quiet August morning, the light coming in through the plantation shutters the way it always does, the coffee warming in my hands. I found an envelope in the drawer of Robert's desk. I had been going through the desk slowly, over many months, the way you do when you're not quite ready to be done with someone's handwriting. The drawer was one I had already been through, I thought, but there it was, tucked behind a divider, smaller than the other letters he'd left, my name on the front, his writing, shorter than the others, just 1 page. He wrote, "I didn't write everything down because some things belong to silence, but I want you to know, that house was always you. Every decision I ever made about it was shaped by the fact that you would live there long after I did. I'm glad of what we built. I'm glad it will hold you." And then, at the bottom, in slightly smaller letters, "Tell Margot to open the door sometimes. She'll know what I mean." I called Margot. She went quiet on the phone for a full minute. Then she said, "I know what he means." I said, "I know you do." We stayed on the phone without talking for a while. The long-distance silence of two people in the same grief, sharing it. Eventually she said, "Mom, are you okay?" I said, "I'm better than okay." She said, "Good." I said, "See you Sunday." She said, "See you Sunday." I hung up the phone and put it down on the kitchen table and sat for a moment in the quiet house. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The porch light made its pool of gold in the garden, even though it was morning. I'd left it on from the night before, the way I sometimes do. The gardenias were spent by August, but the garden was still there, green and living in the morning light. The house on Gaston Street stood as it has stood, as it will stand, and I poured myself a second cup of coffee, and I stayed. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now, hit like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It helps us keep sharing stories about strong women, families, and life's unexpected turns. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. See you in the next video.